this episode, we're going to be looking at the Russian way of war, part 3. The Russian way of war is a complex and multifaceted strategy that has evolved over centuries, shaped by historical experiences, cultural factors, and geopolitical ambitions. Central to understanding the Russian way of war is their military doctrine, which emphasizes overwhelming force and rapid maneuvers. The concept of mass plays a crucial role. This involves deploying large numbers of troops and equipment to achieve decisive victories. However, this strategy often comes at significant cost to human life, as commanders may view casualties as an acceptable sacrifice for achieving broader military goals. Historically, the Soviet Union demonstrated a willingness to absorb heavy losses during conflicts. The Battle of Stalingrad during World War II serves as a poignant example where Soviet forces suffered immense casualties but ultimately achieved victory. The invasion of Finland in November 1939 ended in Russia's technical victory, as the brave Finns ultimately surrendered. Psychologically, however, the mighty Red Army was defeated, having lost in 4 months nearly 200,000 men, 1,100 tanks, and 684 aircraft, while the Finns, who had no tanks, lost 25,000 men and 61 aircraft. It was an appalling performance on the part of a military that deployed 1 million men, who faced just 300,000 Finns, 80% of whom were reservists. Even more perplexing was Russia's performance in its war with Poland in 1920. It was sparked by Poland's invasion of Ukraine and occupation of Kyiv in the spring of that year, an offensive that was followed by a Soviet counterattack that pushed the Poles back to the border. Now overconfident and hoping to use the momentum to spread the young communist evolution westward, Lenin ordered Poland's invasion without consulting his government and ignoring the otherwise militant Leon Trotsky's advice. The Red Army thus charged west, only to be stopped outside Warsaw and then pushed beyond the original border. Unlike the Finnish War, this one ended in full defeat, both militarily and politically. Even so, Russia's defeat by Japan in 1905 was much worse. Faced with Russia's emergence in a Chinese seaport, Japan attacked it, and Russia responded by sending a fleet from the Baltic Sea all the way to the Far East, where it was swiftly scuppered by the Japanese. The defeat, the first handed to Europeans by Asians in 7 centuries, shocked the world, and is seen as a catalyst of Tsarist Russia's downfall the following decade. Even worse was the Crimean War, which began in 1853, when Russia invaded Ottoman lands in today's Moldova and Romania, and ended with all Russian conquest lost, along with some 400,000 soldiers, while British and French armies camped on previously Russian soil. Not only did Russia fail to realise its war's aim, to be recognised as custodian of the Ottoman Empire's Christians, its army lost the status it enjoyed since 1812 as the strongest in the world. The same happened to the Russians last century when they invaded Afghanistan. The Soviet failure in Afghanistan reflected a dying empire's economic bankruptcy, social decay, and political demise. Fear of Moscow's military might was thus broken, a mental transition that soon fed anti-Soviet revolutions across the Soviet bloc. Now an astonishing number of these fiascos' elements is resurfacing as Russia's leaders again succumb to military adventurism's temptations. Like Lenin when he invaded Poland, Vladimir Putin stormed Ukraine consulting no one, deluding himself that his troops would be welcome, only to be met by a nationalist fury for which he did not prepare. Like Stalin when he descended on Finland, Putin failed to consider his prae's ability to fight and its readiness to die. Like Brezhnev when he attacked Afghanistan, Putin failed to configure his economic weakness. Like Nikolai II when he attacked Japan, he failed to realise his military's limitation. And like Nikolai I when he attacked Turkey, he failed to assess the outer world's response. World War I saw the crumbling of empires, and among those to collapse was the Russian Empire of Tsar Nicholas II. When Nicholas declared war against Germany and Austria-Hungary in July 1914, he was the absolute ruler of a realm of nearly 150 million people that stretched from Central Europe to the Pacific and the edge of Afghanistan to the Arctic. Less than 3 years later, in March 1917, After soldiers in Petrograd joined striking workers in protest against Nicholas's rule, the Tsar was forced to abdicate. The following July, he and his family were handed into a cellar by Bolshevik revolutionaries and shot and stabbed to death, ending the Romanov dynasty's 3 centuries of rule. The Battle of Tannenberg, August 26th till August 30th, 1914, East Prussia, now Poland, that ended in a German victory over the Russians. The crushing defeat occurred barely a month into the conflict, but it became emblematic of the Russian Empire's experience in World War I. The Russian commander-in-chief, Grand Duke Nikolai Nikolaevich, a cousin of Emperor Nicholas II, had urged his First and Second Armies to invade East Prussia before they had achieved full readiness. Because the Russians had more than a 2-to-1 superiority, a combined attack had every chance of destroying the Germans between the 2 armies. The plan was sound, but put into the hands of a bumbling fucking idiot, the execution would be different. The man who was in charge of this disastrous plan was General Yakov Grigorievich Zhilinsky, who was chief of the General Staff until early 1914 had made the military convention with France, whereby Russia pledged to put 800,000 men in the field by the 15th day of mobilization. This arrangement overwhelmed the cumbrous Russian war machine, which caused numerous cracks and local failures when it began moving. It also put a strain on the Russian headquarters staff, which consequently made decisions in a state of nervous flurry. Zhilinsky's pledge to the French did not end with this promise, for the plan also envisaged an offensive against the Germans simultaneously with the main thrust against the Austrians. Along the land frontier, 2 Russian armies had been assembled. The first was equipped with 6.5 infantry divisions and 5 cavalry divisions under General Paul von Rennenkampf, and the second was equipped with 10 infantry divisions and 3 cavalry divisions under General Alexander Samsonov. The 2 armies formed a group under the higher control of Zhilinsky. Zhilinsky's plan was that Rennenkampf should advance against East Prussia from the east, drawing upon himself the German defending forces, and then, 2 days later, Samsonov was to cross the German province's southern frontier and bestride the Germans' rear, cutting them off from the Vistula. The fault of this plan lay not in the conception but in the execution. Its potential value was well proved by the alarm, indeed, the dislocation of mind, caused in the German headquarters when the menace was disclosed. However, it suffered 2 natural handicaps. Apart from faulty leadership and military unreadiness, the first was that the 2 armies were separated by the 50-mile or 80-kilometer chain of the Masurian Lakes in southern eastern Prussia, which in conjunction with the fortified Königsberg area, now Kaliningrad, Russia, on the west, narrowed Rennenkampf's line of advance to a gap of only about 40 miles or 64 kilometers wide. Second, the Russians' own invasion from the south was now to be handicapped by the fact that they had left the border country a desert with poor railways and worse roads as a barrier against the German invasion. Rennenkampf crossed the eastern frontier of East Prussia on August the 17th and threw back the bulk of General Max von Prittwitz's 8th Army at the Battle of Gumbinnen. By this time, Samsonov had reached the southern frontier of East Prussia to advance against Friedrich von Scholz's forces. He had been so hurried on by Zhilinsky that his troops were tired and hungry, their transport incomplete, and supply services in chaos. Samsonov's appearance was reported to Prittwitz on August the 20th. Prittwitz, fearing that the Russians would advance on the German rear and cut off his line of retreat, anxiously reported, "The army will therefore break off the fight and retire behind the Vistula." Other senior German officers urged that the counter-thrust on Gumbinnen front should be first driven home, that there was adequate time, and that in any case, a precipitate retreat without fighting would give Samsonov, who was much nearer the Vistula than the Germans at Gumbinnen were, the chance to cut off the main German forces. Prittwitz, however, curtly told them that the decision rested with him and not with them. He then left the office. It was decided that to gain time and room, an attack should be launched against Samsonov's left or western flank. For this purpose, 3 divisions could be railed back from the Gumbinnen area to reinforce the corps, while the remainder of the force there, the Reserve Corps, and General August von Mackensen's corps, were to retreat westward by road. This disposition of forces would be the foundation of the Tannenberg manoeuvre. On returning to the office, Prittwitz agreed to their moves and spoke no more of retreating behind the Vistula. The next day, he grew quite cheerful when word came that his forces had been disengaged safely from Rennenkampf's front and that Samsonov had almost come to a standstill. On August the 22nd, when the German 8th Army headquarters had been moved north to Mulhausen, a telegram arrived which announced that a special train was on its way with the new commander-in-chief of the 8th Army, Paul von Hindenburg. Accompanying Hindenburg as his chief of staff was the hero of the Liege attack, Erich Ludendorff. Developing a plan which, with the necessary movements, had been initiated by Hoffmann, Ludendorff concentrated some 6 divisions against Samsonov's left wing. This force, inferior in strength to the Russians, could not have been decisive. However, Ludendorff, finding that Rennenkampf was still near Gumbinnen, took the calculated risk of withdrawing the rest of the German troops, except the cavalry screen, from that front and rushing them back against Samsonov's right wing. This daring move was aided by the absence of communication between the 2 Russian commanders and by the ease with which the Germans deciphered Samsonov's wireless orders to his corps. Under the converging blows, Samsonov's flanks would be crushed and his centre surrounded. The calculated daring of the Tannenberg plan owed much to an earlier experience of Hoffmann's. Alfred Graf von Schlieffen had been picked as a young captain to go in as observer with the Japanese forces in the Russo Japanese War.
Hoffmann had sent him, and with him there,
Hoffmann learned much about the Russian army, not least that 2 generals, Rennenkampf and Samsonov, represented dueling factions within the upper levels of command. In Hoffmann's judgment, Rennenkampf would be in no hurry to aid Samsonov by pressing on from Gumbinnen. He had also learned in Manchuria the incredible carelessness of Russian communication methods. This knowledge led him, in August 1914, to accept intercepted Russian wireless orders sent out in clear as authentic, whereas his seniors were distrustfully inclined to regard them as an artful deception. Upon his arrival in East Prussia on August the 23rd, Ludendorff was pleasantly surprised to find that the movements already in progress fitted in with his own half-formed plan, and he confirmed Hoffmann's arrangements. Then, on August the 25th, intercepted wireless messages showed him the slowlessness of Rennenkampf's movements. He began to think that he could use Mackensen's corps as well, leaving only the cavalry to watch and occupy Rennenkampf. Thereby, he might strike hard not at one, but at both of Samsonov's flanks and bring off a decisive double envelopment. Samsonov, meantime, had been staggering forward, driven on by telegraphic lashes from Jelinsky, who had jumped to the conclusion that the Germans were doing what Pritzwitz had contemplated, retreating to the Vistula. In driving Samsonov on to cut them off, Jelinsky not only neglected to hasten Rennenkampf, but even diverted his energy by orders to invest Königsberg. Meanwhile, Samsonov's army was spread out over a front of nearly 60 miles, about 100 kilometers, and his right, centre and left were widely separated. If they had been linked by mobility, this width might have been an advantage, but with sluggish troops and bad roads, it became a danger. Schultz's corps had been slowly giving way and wheeling back before the advance of the Russian centre, toward the Allenstein-Osterode line. Fearing the effect of a further retirement, Ludendorff ordered General Hermann von Francois, with his corps on the right of Schultz's, to attack on August the 26th and to break through the Russian left wing. The real crisis of the battle, as a whole, came on August the 27th. That morning, Francois, now amply supplied with shells, opened a fierce bombardment on the position of the Russian left wing near Uzdal. The demoralized Russian troops broke in flight without waiting for the German infantry. Francois ordered the pursuit to be made toward Neidenberg to get across the rear of the Russian centre, but a Russian counterattack against his outer flank caused him to wheel south towards Soldau. At daybreak on August the 28th, discovering that the beaten Russian left wing had retreated from Soldau across the frontier, Francois once more turned his forces eastward toward Neidenberg. By the night of August 29th, Francois's troops held the road from Neidenberg to Willenberg, with a chain of entrenched posts between. This formed a barricade across the line of retreat of the Russians. With its rear closed and its roads congested, the Russian centre dissolved into a mob of hungry and exhausted men, who beat feebly against the ring of fire and then surrendered in the tens of thousands. The crowning sense of the tragedy was enacted by Samsonov himself, who had moved up from Neidenberg on August 27th to control the battle, only to find himself caught up in the swirling chaos of the retreat. Unable to do anything, he turned and rode south again on August 28th, only to get lost in the depths of the forest. In the early morning hours of August 30th, he turned aside and his absence was unnoticed by his staff until a solitary shot rang out. He had taken his own life rather than survive the disaster. His body was ultimately recovered by German troops. The Russians lost 30,000 killed or wounded, while the Germans sustained a total of only 13,000 casualties. Some 92,000 Russian prisoners were taken, 2.5 army corps annihilated, and the remaining half of Samsonov's army severely shaken. The Russians also lost 400 artillery pieces and other vital war material. After Tannenberg and the arrival of 2 fresh army corps from the Western Front, the Germans turned on the slowly advancing Rennenkampf, whose lack of energy was partly due to his losses at Gumbinnen and to his subsequent lack of information. Attacked on a line extending from east of Königsberg to the southern end of the chain of the Manchurian Lakes on September the 5th to the 17th, Rennenkampf was driven from East Prussia. As a result of these East Prussian battles, Russia had lost 250,000 men, and what could be afforded still less, much war material. There, guys, I'm going to end this episode of the Russian Way of War, Tannenberg. Thanks for watching, and as always, Slava Ukraini, Herium Slava. I'll leave you with an example of a bit more of a modern day demonstration of a Russian officer motivating the next wave of meat.
Погибнуть всем, знайте одно, нас, мать Россия, никогда не забудет. Всем нам будут еще столетия нести цветы к нашим именам. Каждое имя бойца будет высечено на доске обелисков. Нам всем зажгут вечные огни.